Okay, hello, friends of sophisticated color. Today I'm covering the render page again. I highly recommend watching our first module, 0302, Rendering and Deliverables, from the Essentials part of our Baselight learning program before you watch today's session. I will post a link to this module in the comments below the video. And as usual, please ask questions in the chat during the live session or comment below the videos. And now, let's begin. Today, I want to dig a bit deeper into the render options that we have available here on the render page. And the first option is in the resolution line, that menu here, max quality, optimized, and draft. And we have the same option available in the cursor settings here. So what do these options mean? The default for the render is always max quality, and the default in the cursor is optimized. Here, my first shot is a 6K Sony Venice XOCN clip, and my output format is currently set to 1920 1080 in the cursor. And what the optimized mode is doing is, here it says decode at half resolution where possible for speed. And the crucial factor is the ratio between the output format, which is here the cursor format, but could also be the render format, and the input format. If the output format is half the size of the input format or smaller, it will attempt a half-res decode of the input. So in that case now, we are decoding to 1920 1080. That is smaller than half the resolution of the input. That would be 3K. And so that means Baselight in optimized mode is requesting a 3K image from the Sony SDK in the decode pass. And we can see a small difference on the image if we examine some fine structures very carefully. Now I'm switching from optimized to max quality, and you can see some of the pixels shifting around, and in optimized mode they are a little bit dirtier here color-wise at fine details. But in certain cases that could be a good trade-off. If, for example, if we're rendering dailies or other screeners, often speed can be a more important factor than the highest image quality. And to make it clearer, another example here, I set my output format to Ultra HD. Now what we should see is that the image stays identical between optimized and max quality. And the reason is that Ultra HD is not smaller than 3K, which is half of the input resolution. So Baselight is always decoding at max quality. And the draft option attempts even lower res decodes if it makes sense based on the resolution. So for example, if we are having an 8K input shot and we're decoding it to 1920 1080, then it would attempt a quarter res decode. Okay, moving on to a common problem in rendering. Let's say we have these two clips here. The first one is our Sony XOCN MXF file, and the second one is an .ari ARRI raw image sequence. We want to render all of our clips into individual QuickTime files with the grade applied to it. I already started with this render preset here. For the file name, I have chosen input file name. So let's select the first two shots and see what happens. Here's our renders folder, progress graded, today's date, and we can see the MXF file is rendered correctly, but for the ARI sequence, it created one QuickTime file for every frame of the clip. So this is definitely not what we want to do. So that's not our desired render. So I will delete this one here. And so let's see how we can fix that. What we need to do is we need to turn off the input file name option, because otherwise, as we saw Baselight will render each frame to the input file name of the ARI sequence. The same would happen with DNG sequences or DPX or EXR sequences, for example. And instead of the render variable of %W, which jumps back here to input file name, we need to use %w. Lowercase w is made exactly for these kind of cases. It removes the last digits from any input file name. So let's render it one more time and see how it looks. Here we have our new render, and now it looks correct. One thing to note is that the %w removes any kind of number at the end of the input file name. So even if a MXF or QuickTime file ends with some digits at the end, they will be removed, which might not be desired in your specific workflow. In these cases, you should maybe find another solution like rendering to the clip name or modifying clip or tape names before rendering in shots view via expressions. Okay, the next example is rendering multiple cuts from one single timeline into multiple QuickTime files. I call the deliverable preset graded cuts. And in this case, we don't want to use the input file name for rendering. And we want to render this edit here into one ProRes file, this edit into one ProRes, and also this edit into one ProRes. So there is no direct render variable for this kind of thing available. But what we need to do is we need to create metadata in shots view that is consistent for each cut, but different between the individual cuts that we're having here in the timeline. So these could be different cuts of the same commercial, for example. So I open shots view and I create a new custom column as a text column, and I call it cut. So I don't have a better name. And now I'm selecting always all the shots in group grading mode and labeling them with the name. So now I'm moving forward to here in the timeline to this shot and maybe saying select all after. Now labeling this cut 2 and going to our third cut, doing the same, deselect all, select all after, and saying here cut 3. So in this case, we definitely need to manage and curate the metadata in shots view before rendering. But now we have one column available called cut that distinguishes the 3 QuickTime files. So now I'm doing a select all because we don't want to render the ranges here with no clips in between the different cuts. This would throw error messages during rendering. So here I go to selected shots. So we have the 3 cuts as render ranges. So now I'm going into the file name and deleting the input file name and entering %, opening brackets, the name of my shots view column, closing brackets, enter. And we can see the first clip would be rendered to the file cut-1. And of course we can add other things to that. And we could add also another date tag to each file if we would render it again. So now let's kick off that render and see how it works. I just noticed I have 2 deliverables still preset, so I should deactivate our first example, only render 1 deliverable. So this is always a good practice. Before you press that button here, check the number and if it makes sense. And here we are. We have our 3 rendered clips as individual ProRes files, as desired. Okay, the next example is a typical scenario for VFX pulls. So the task is we need to name every shot that we render starting with frame number 1001. So this is a typical request for VFX pulls. So how do we achieve that? Here I put together that slide for you that shows some file numbering expressions, and the by far most common one is the one starting each shot with a given number, let's say 1001, and the expression example is f minus e plus then the start frame number. Let's show you how this is done. So I jump back to our timeline here, and then we go to render page. Let's do another copy of the deliverables, and let's call this VFX pulls. Let's activate this deliverable. Let's switch this back to OpenEXR sequences. And here at the bottom, we can see instead of shot frame number or scene frame number, we can switch over to expression. And then we just type f minus e plus the start frame number. And we can see if we remove this part here, or we might add a dot in between, so that this first shot would start rendering at frame number 1001. And if we would render that shot number 6 from the timeline, it would also start at frame number 1001. If you include some handles in the shots, then you could also start numbering, for example, at frame number 990 or 991. But the question is, yeah, that might all work well, but then there's that one shot that has not enough handles at the start, so the whole idea does not work anymore. Then you can do a little bit more advanced workflow, and we switch back to shots view one more time. Let's get rid of our cut column, and let's create a new custom column, and I call it shot start frame, and the column type is an integer. And so now I select all my shots. Okay, let's activate group grading. Go into one of the shots and set this to 990. And now we can use that column also on the render page. I deactivate group grading, close shots view, go in here, and instead of 990, we type the name of our column, case sensitive. And so now we can see that shot here will again start rendering at 990. And let's change the value now. For example, for let's go here back to shot number 6. Yes. Let's say here we start numbering at 995. And we should see this shot here would now start numbering at frame number 995, but shot number 7, like all the other ones, at frame number 990. Another common request for VFX pulls is rendering various different input aspect ratios to one common resolution. For example, we need to render all shots to 2.8K resolution, but they have various input aspect ratios. Here, this one here is a wider aspect ratio than this shot here, for example. And of course, we should always avoid baking in black letter or pillar boxes into footage. This should always be avoided because it will cause problems downstream in the image processing. For example, with a blur, it will blur in the black areas into the frame here at the border. And also all the spatial operators that we're applying on an image will not like black areas being baked into the shot. So we should definitely render then each input format to a different output format depending on the aspect ratio, but they should all share the same width. So that's the task. How should we approach that? Of course, one thing is we group the footage into the different input formats and then render each format with a custom mapping into a special output format. But in this case, I want to use a little bit smarter technique on the render page that I want to show you. So let's set up our render. Let's say we're rendering ACES linear plates. Video LUT should be no scale. And max quality, of course. So let's get the mask option here and the render format into the equation. So first I need to create a new custom format with the width that we need to render to. So let's say our target render width is 2880. So I create a new format with the same width and height. So it's a square format, 2880 by 2880. All right, fair enough. I should map it to my working format. And in that case, we should map it based on the width. Yeah, that looks good to me. And so now we will render to this output format, to that square 2880 output format. So this would now render a lot of black letterboxes into each of the output clips. But in the mask option, we have a smart thing here. We can render with the input area mask, and instead of masking the input area, we can say crop image to mask. So this will crop each image during rendering to the area of its input. And so this will then give us the desired result. So let's render these first two shots here as an example. I just adjust my render path. Let's call this VFX pull. Date folder is good. Yeah, input file name without trailing digits looks good. I need to select the correct render range. And let's kick off the render. So here's our VFX pull folder. And first we can examine, okay, each shot starts numbering at frame number 990. But what about the resolutions? Probably better to check this in Flux Manage. So this shot here is now rendered to 2880 by 1922, and this one here to 2880 by 10,082. So all share the same width, but differ in their height. Okay, and the last quick thing I want to show you is that here on the bottom we have always the render command. So what does this give us? So this can be sometimes helpful when you're dealing with multiple Baselight machines, because you can just copy that command to the clipboard and then jump into the terminal, paste that command into the terminal, for example, on a different Baselight machine in your same Baselight cloud array, and then hit return. And this render command will then be executed in the command line render on another Baselight machine. Typically, that is not required anymore because we also have the queue management here on the bottom, and you can also access the queues of different machines here inside the queue monitor. But sometimes it might be helpful, for example, if you're logged into a machine via SSH or something like that. Okay, this wraps up my topic list for today. All right, there was one question about embedding metadata into renders, for example, for sending them over to Avid Media Composer. This is something that I did not show in detail today. So let's go back to the render page, and there we have the metadata section. So here in the metadata section, we can decide which kind of metadata for timecode, tape name, and for other deliverable types. We can also define a clip name we want to embed into this render. So if we render the whole timeline in one piece, typically we want to embed the timeline timecode, for example. But if we render each shot individually as a single asset, then typically we want to embed the shot or the file timecode. So what is the difference between file and shot timecode? The same here is for the tape name. There's a file tape name and a shot tape name. The file timecode is directly read from the input file without further modification. The same is true for the file tape name. And the shot tape name is derived from the tape column here in shots view. So here we can modify the tape name. We could type a custom name for one shot in it, or we can modify it via expressions, for example. So that's the main difference. And the same is true for the time code. So there's a way of modifying the shot values before outputting them. So this is the key difference. And another common render topic that I did not cover in the main session is rendering a handful of still frames from a timeline. Maybe I quickly show how I would approach that. So there are multiple ways of doing that, of course, as usual with Baselight. But one way is if someone wants to have just like 3 reference stills from the timeline, I would put markers on these reference frames. So let's use this one here, that one, and then also here one from the middle clip, maybe this one. Then we go to the render page, and here for the selected frames, we can also say strip marked frames. We could select the categories, but we just say select all. And now we have the render range here set to our reference frames. And then we would, of course, set the render settings accordingly. Another way, if you want to render every shot, one still for every shot in the timeline, is using the poster frames. So if we go up here, we can say poster frames, which per default is always the middle frame of each shot. But on some shots, you might not be happy with the poster frame. So there you might say, okay, for example, on this shot here, we really want, let's say here, the beginning of the shot. Then you can also modify the poster frame. And the command for that is Command P on Mac or Control P on Linux. And so then you could go through the timeline and adjust the poster frame for each clip so that you're happy, and then render all the poster frames, for example. Okay, so thanks again for watching today, and see you for the next session. Bye-bye.